This week, we're going to be considering methods for researching how media industries work by closely studying the people who work in them. Now, the purpose of doing this is to show how media work and creativity quite often embraces social issues. So, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move away from what we would call normative questions about media industries towards more cultural understandings of how media work gets done. And this is a powerful way of relating media industries to the wider political, economic, and social context within which they work. And the case we're going to make is that it doesn't really make any sense to separate media work from those factors. So, one of the important things that we're going to appreciate when we finish this session is that it isn't very realistic, very practical, or indeed very interesting to approach media industries and media industries work as a set of processes that are there to be done in a particular way. It's really more interesting and more insightful to study how work is done in relation to other things, and particularly the personality and experiences of the people who are working in media industries. And to get to this, we're going to focus very specifically on a particular media industry, the world of journalism, and experiences of gender therein. Now, why are we focusing in on this? Well, I suppose if we were going to talk about normative approaches to media industries, journalism is one of the professions that we might approach from the most normative point of view. That is, most of us would think, and for understandable reasons, that journalism is about a set of professional practices that are to be applied in the same way, regardless of who's doing them. So it shouldn't really matter whether you're male, female, whether you're born in Australia, born in India, born in China, whatever it is. You should be able to do journalism in the same way, that you should be able to write the same stories using the same sorts of professional practices. And the fact of the matter is that a close analysis of journalism in practice has shown that that's never really been true. And one of the interesting things that we're going to see is that the last few years have seen a rising interest and a rise in the number of female journalists. But that rise is happening in certain parts of the world and is happening for certain political, economic, and cultural reasons. And all of those things have really changed our perceptions of journalism and the nature of what journalism is. And that is that certain women journalists have really been responsible for changing understandings of how journalism should operate in affecting different methods of doing journalism, which have afforded different perspectives on the world to their audiences. But the interesting thing in close studies of these female journalists is that those changes aren't simply the product of imagination. They are the product of many of the conditions and restraints that female journalists work underneath. And very often, many of the changes that women journalists have brought into the profession have reflected the dangers that they face by virtue of their gender. And so, what this does is it serves as a really useful case study on two things. Firstly, on the purpose of doing media industry research, on the purpose of studying how media people exercise their creativity within particular constraints in media industries. Secondly, it demonstrates a really useful method, which is the method of selecting a key informant. In looking at evidence about how female researchers, how women journalists do their work, what we can see is a broader principle: the value of taking particular people who work in media industries and using them as a symbol of the wider dynamics that affect that industry. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on a particular journalist, a British journalist called Kate Adie. Although we are going to be talking about women journalists in other parts of the world, particularly Iraq. But we're going to be studying Kate Adie as a kind of an exemplar of a case study of a particular media worker whose experiences reflect particular changes in the journalism industry, but who is also a case study in how journalism has been afflicted by sexism, which has created different working conditions and different working expectations for the men and women who practice in that field. So at the end of this, we're going to be understanding how we can approach media work from a cultural perspective, one which places creativity in an organizational framework which is affected by culture, politics, and history. And we're also going to be being introduced to the role of gender in understanding, as a kind of a sensitizing topic in understanding how media industries work. And we're going to be doing that through looking at the question of how to understand the concept of creativity in media industries. We're going to be thinking about why gender has become a particular issue in changing media practices over the last 20 years or so. We're going to be looking at Kate Adie and discussing why we should look at her. What does she teach us about not only journalism and gender, but about where we can find evidence to talk about how media industries work. And then we're going to be ending with a discussion on gender and media industries and just knocking around a few ideas about some other places where we can apply some of these ideas. So that's the plan for this week.